Boss disdains and humiliates black employee but finds out she's the heir of the company. Deeply regrets his behavior after discovering the truth. The clock struck 8:02 when Isabella arrived at the office, balancing a stack of reports and her still-hot coffee. The atmosphere was already filled with the sound of keys being rapidly pressed, phones ringing, and hurried voices discussing deadlines and numbers. Andrade and Lima was a whirlwind of ambition and constant pressure, and she moved through it all without drawing attention. She walked down the corridor to her desk, but before she could even sit down, Gustavo's voice sliced through the environment like a blade. Andrade, finally. He didn't even look up from the computer screen. I hope you brought the investment department reports. I need them for the meeting with the directors. Isabella placed the papers on his desk, maintaining a firm posture. They are all organized and reviewed, as requested. Gustavo took the stack without even thanking her, flipping through the documents with a skeptical expression. I hope you haven't made the same mistakes as last time. The board doesn't have patience for amateurish errors. She kept her gaze fixed on the man in front of her, but didn't respond. Any attempt to justify her work would be seen as a challenge. Gustavo didn't want efficiency. He wanted submission. He scoffed when he saw the reports were impeccable, and, without looking at her, gestured impatiently. Still here? We have coffee in the meeting room. You can make sure everything is ready, Isabella. Nodded and left, feeling the gazes of some colleagues following her steps. Some of them had already been targets of Gustavo's arrogance, but no one dared confront him. He was the type of boss who loved to exercise his power subtly, wearing down subordinates little by little, undermining their confidence until they became obedient shadows. Upon arriving at the meeting room, she began organizing the cups and thermal bottles. She heard voices approaching and soon identified Gustavo talking to one of the directors. The new team needs a better filter. We already have too many people. Trying to stand out when they should just be doing the basics. The tone of disdain was unmistakable. Isabella maintained her composure, but felt the anger grow within her. Minutes later, the meeting began. Sitting at the back of the room, she watched Gustavo present a strategic plan for the coming months. The problem was that many of those ideas weren't his. They were hers. He had taken her suggestions, made small adjustments, and presented them as if they were his own. She watched as he received praise from the board, a satisfied smile appearing on his face. Great job, Gustavo. If we continue on this path, we'll see solid growth next quarter. He thanked them as if he had actually accomplished something grand. Isabella felt the bitter taste of betrayal rising, breathed deeply. His moment would come, and when it did, Gustavo would have no idea what hit him. The sound of chairs being pushed back marked the end of the meeting. Gustavo shook hands with the directors, smiling, as if he alone carried the weight of the company's success. Isabella gathered the papers left on the table, keeping her head down, but her mind was racing. Every compliment Gustavo received, every approving look from the board, every word he used to boast about ideas that weren't his, only fueled her determination. Excellent presentation, Gustavo, said one of the directors, giving him a friendly pat on the back. You really understand what the company needs. Gustavo smiled, full of himself. I just do what's necessary to ensure that Andrade and Lima keeps growing. Isabella swallowed her urge to laugh. If he only knew who was truly securing the company's future, he wouldn't speak so arrogantly. As the executives dispersed, Gustavo turned to Isabella. You took too long to serve the coffee. The board doesn't like unnecessary interruptions. She stared at him for a moment. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Gustavo shrugged, satisfied, and left the room with the confidence of a man who thought he was untouchable. Isabella spent the rest of the day completing her tasks with her usual efficiency. But something inside her felt different. The patience she had maintained for so long was wearing thin. She wasn't in a hurry, but the right moment was approaching. At the end of the workday, while organizing some files, she overheard a conversation near the coffee area. Did you see Gustavo in the meeting? He knows how to sell himself like no one else. Yeah, but I heard he has a habit of taking credit for others' ideas. Of course he does. Do you really think he can do it all by himself? The guy just knows how to delegate and take the credit. Isabella continued her work, pretending not to hear, but a small satisfaction grew within her. If even the employees were noticing Gustavo's game, it would only be a matter of time before he could no longer hide who he really was. The next day, when she arrived at the office, she found Gustavo standing next to her desk, holding a report with the tips of his fingers as if it were something repulsive. "This is awful," he said, shaking the paper. Isabella frowned. "The report is accurate. The data was reviewed 3 times. Gustavo sighed dramatically. "Right or not, it's poorly formatted. It looks like it was done by someone inexperienced. If you want to stay here, you need to learn to do things properly." She felt her blood boil. It wasn't about the report. It was about power. He wanted to show that he was in control, that she would never be good enough no matter what she did. "I'll redo it," she said, taking the paper from his hand. "That is, if there's still time," Gustavo retorted, turning on his heels and walking away. Isabella looked at the document and realized it was perfect. He just wanted a reason to belittle her. At the end of the day, when everyone began leaving the office, she received an email. It was an invitation to a board meeting the following morning. One detail caught her attention. The subject was new shareholding structure and strategic changes. She smiled to herself. The moment was approaching. The email remained open on the screen for long seconds as Isabella absorbed every word. New shareholding structure and strategic changes. She knew exactly what that meant. The moment she had patiently waited for was finally coming to fruition. The next morning, Andrade and Lima was even busier than usual. Whispers filled the corridors, and although no one knew exactly what the meeting was about, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Gustavo, as always, walked with the arrogant posture of someone who believed he was in absolute control of the situation. "Any important news?" asked one of the managers as he saw him pass by. Gustavo smirked. "I don't know. But if it's something big, I'll certainly be at the center of the decisions." The two laughed, unaware that Isabella was nearby, organizing some documents. She said nothing, just calmly adjusted the papers and headed to the meeting room. The auditorium was full when she arrived. The company's top directors occupied the front seats, and at the back, other employees were allowed to watch the announcement. Gustavo sat at the front, as if already expecting to be called for a new position. He crossed his arms, relaxed, watching the executives chat among themselves as they waited for the presentation to begin. Then the door opened. The interim CEO, a gray-haired man with a serious expression, entered accompanied by a small group of people. Among them was Isabella. Her navy blue suit contrasted with her warm skin tone, and her posture was impeccable. She walked with the confidence of someone who was exactly where she should be. Gustavo blinked a few times, confused to see her in that position. He frowned, as if trying to understand what was happening. The CEO approached the podium and took the microphone, silencing the murmurs in the room. "Thank you all for being here. Today is a day of change for Andrade and Lima. As you know, with João Andrade's passing, a new shareholding structure has been established, and now it's time to formalize this transition." Gustavo still did not seem to fully understand. "With that, I am pleased to announce the new majority shareholder and CEO of Andrade and Lima." Gustavo's eyes were fixed on the stage, waiting to hear a familiar name. But when the CEO turned to Isabella and gestured for her to take her place, he felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Isabella Andrade. Shock coursed through the auditorium like a wave. Isabella stepped onto the stage, took the microphone, and faced the audience. "Over the past few months, I have had the opportunity to work closely with many of you, to understand the company's dynamics firsthand, and to see with my own eyes what works and what needs to change." Her gaze found Gustavo in the crowd. "I also saw what happens when power and arrogance replace competence and respect." Gustavo's face drained of color. Understanding finally hit him with the weight of a collapsing building. The woman he humiliated, belittled and ignored was, in fact, the true owner of the company. The silence in the conference room was suffocating. All eyes were fixed on Isabella. The woman who had been treated for months as just an assistant, now revealed as the true heir of Andrade and Lima. Gustavo, who always spoke loudly and laughed scornfully, now could not make a sound. His face was rigid, his breath quickened, his eyes locked on her as if trying to find a trace of the submissive assistant he thought he knew. But she was no longer there. Isabella maintained her firm posture as she scanned the room, analyzing every face, every reaction. Many of those present were shocked, some embarrassed, others clearly relieved to realize that the era of arrogance and abuse of power might be coming to an end. As I said, she continued, her voice steady, over the past months, I had the opportunity to see the company from the inside, to understand its structure, and most importantly, to know the people who make this organization thrive. She paused, allowing her words to settle in the minds of the listeners. But I also saw who takes advantage of power to humiliate and silence others. Her eyes landed directly on Gustavo, and this time he could not hold her gaze. His jaw tightened, and he fidgeted his fingers over the table, as if desperately searching for something to say, but there was nothing he could say. As the majority shareholder and now CEO of this company, my priority will be to ensure that the work environment is based on merit and respect, not authoritarianism and abuse of power. The employees who had been victims of Gustavo's disdain exchanged discreet glances. One of them, sitting at the back of the room, swallowed hard, trying to suppress a smile of satisfaction. What does that mean exactly? Gustavo finally found his voice, but it no longer held the confidence it once had. Isabella tilted her head slightly as if she had been waiting for that question. It means that Andrade and Lima will no longer be a place where employees are belittled by those who should lead by example. It means that your management style will be evaluated, with the same strict criteria you use to evaluate others. The tension in the room escalated. Gustavo felt sweat accumulate at the nape of his neck. Isabella, Ms. Andra of... She interrupted him, her voice sharp as a razor's edge. Gustavo blinked, unsure whether he was more shocked by her tone or the coldness with which she corrected him. Mrs. Andrade, he repeated with difficulty. I recognize that. I may have been a bit too harsh, but everything I did was for the company. I always had the best interests in mind. Isabella raised an eyebrow, holding back a slight smile of disdain. The best interests. You ridiculed employees, took credit for ideas that weren't yours, and used your position to oppress those below you. That's not leadership. That's fear. The entire room was focused on the confrontation. Some employees seemed to be holding their breath. Gustavo opened his mouth to protest, but Isabella continued before he could say anything. And fear never made anyone grow. Gustavo felt a wave of panic. For the first time, he was not in control. For the first time, he didn't know how. To escape a situation with his arrogance intact. I can change, he said, his voice less imposing than he wished. I can prove I deserve to be here. Isabella crossed her arms. I like results, Gustavo. You've always said that, haven't you? That results are more important than words. Then show me. She closed the folder on the table and stepped back, concluding the conversation. From now on, you will be evaluated like any other employee in this company. If you want to prove you can be part of the future of Andrade and Lima, you'll have to earn it. The air felt thin around Gustavo. He had never been put in this position before. He had never had to prove anything. He was always the one evaluating others, always the one determining who was worthy and who was not. Now he was on the other side. Isabella cast one last glance at the room before turning to walk out. The meeting is over, get back to work. The employees began to rise, some still exchanging discreet smiles. Gustavo remained seated, feeling his throat dry as the weight of what had just happened crashed down on him. Nothing would ever be the same. Gustavo felt tension coursing through his body as the employees left the conference room. His heart raced, but his mind desperately tried to find a way out. He needed to react. He couldn't just accept this. For years, he had built his position within Andrade and Lima, cultivating respect, or at least a fear disguised as respect. Now everything was crumbling, and the cause was a woman he had underestimated from day one. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie and stood up, walking quickly to his office. As he passed through the corridor, he felt the stares upon him, some discreet, others filled with restrained satisfaction. For the first time, Gustavo was the subject of the whispers, and it made him boil inside. As he entered his office, he slammed the door shut and sank into his chair. He needed to act fast. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of one of the company's older directors, Cesar Duarte, a man with whom he had always maintained good relations. "Cesar, did you see what happened?" His voice tried to sound firm, but there was a slight tremor of frustration. "Everyone saw, Gustavo," Cesar replied, his voice neutral. "It seems we underestimated the new CEO." Gustavo clenched his fists on the table. "This can't stay like this. She came in here as an assistant. For God's sake! I can't accept this humiliation." Cesar let out a sigh before responding. "Look, Gustavo, my recommendation is that you lower your head and adapt. Her position is solid. She has control of the company and won't hesitate to cut those who don't. Fit in." Gustavo felt a knot in his throat. He had never had to prove himself before. It was always him who decided who stayed and who left. But now he was being tested. "So you're saying I should just accept it?" "I'm saying you should be smart. She gave you a chance. Take it or you'll be out." Gustavo didn't respond. He simply hung up the phone and stared at the empty computer screen. For the first time in years, he felt something he didn't recognize: fear. In the following days, Andrade and Lima underwent significant changes. Isabella officially took the position and began restructuring the company culture. New mentorship programs were implemented, giving more opportunities to employees who had previously been overlooked. Performance reports were reviewed, and those who wielded power abusively began to be sidelined. Gustavo felt each change as a personal blow. Control slipped through his fingers, and he didn't know how to regain it. But the worst part was watching. How employees began to open up, feeling more comfortable under the new leadership. The previously tense smiles were now genuine. The conversations that once happened in whispers became freer. That's when he realized if he wanted to stay in the company, he would have to change. But change did not come easy for him. In a team meeting, Isabella was presenting a new internal development project. Gustavo listened attentively but maintained a closed expression. "We want to give a voice to all sectors so that good ideas are recognized, regardless of hierarchical position." The words were simple, yet loaded with meaning. Under Gustavo's leadership, this would have never happened. He always believed that leadership meant power, not collaboration. Then Isabella did something unexpected. "Gustavo, would you like to share your vision on how we can improve this process?" All eyes turned to him. He knew they were waiting to see how he would react. He cleared his throat and chose his words carefully. "I think there is value in listening to those at the base of the company." The room fell silent. Moment of silence, but Isabella smiled faintly, acknowledging the effort, even if forced. "I'm glad you think that way. I want you to be part of this project and work with the team to ensure it works as well as possible." It was at that moment that Gustavo realized Isabella didn't just want to remove him from the company. She wanted to transform him, but was he ready for that? Gustavo felt the weight of the decision he had to make. Isabella had given him a chance, something he would never have offered to someone in her position. He could continue to resist, fighting against the tide, trying to reclaim the authority he once used to oppress. But deep down he knew there was no longer any room for his arrogance. If he didn't adapt, he would be discarded like so many other employees he himself had looked down upon in the past. In the following days, he began to engage more in the meetings and projects he had previously ignored. At first, it was uncomfortable. He didn't know how to participate in conversations where his voice was not the only one that mattered. He had to listen, acknowledge mistakes, accept criticism, and worst of all, learn. But with each meeting, with each implemented suggestion, he began to see a side of the company he had never paid attention to. The transformation was slow, and not everyone believed it was genuine. Some employees still looked at him with suspicion, used to seeing him as someone who only pulled others down. But Isabella watched everything closely, analyzing every move. She didn't just want to punish him. She wanted him to prove that he was capable of change. It was during a strategic meeting that he faced his first true test. They were discussing a new employee incentive program, something Gustavo would have dismissed without hesitation before. But this time he leaned forward, contemplating the issue. "I think we can go further," he said, surprising everyone. "If we want to improve the corporate environment, we need to invest in continuous training and real growth opportunities. Otherwise, this will just be a marketing ploy." The eyes turned to Isabella, waiting for her reaction. She crossed her arms and smiled faintly. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, "and I hope you're willing to help implement these changes." Gustavo nodded, and for the first time he felt that his presence was not only tolerated but valued. He was not just trying to hold on to his position, he was for the first time trying to do the right thing. Over the months, the change solidified. Andrade and Lima became a more collaborative environment, and Gustavo, once a symbol of arrogance and authoritarianism, began to be seen differently. He still carried the marks of his past, and he knew some would never fully forgive him, but he learned to live with that. The transformation was not just about saving his position, but about becoming a true leader. Isabella, for her part, fulfilled her mission. Upon taking over the company, he not only claimed what was rightfully his, but also restored the dignity of employees who had previously been invisible. Under his leadership, Andrade and Lima thrived not only financially, but also as a beacon of respect and inclusion. One day, after a long meeting about new projects, Gustavo stayed behind in the room while Isabella was putting away some documents. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you for not firing me." She paused for a moment, looked up and smiled faintly. "I never wanted to just get you out of here, Gustavo. I wanted to give you the chance you never gave anyone." He nodded, knowing those words were true. "I think I'm finally understanding what it means to be a leader." Isabella closed her folder and crossed her arms, assessing him for a moment. "I hope so. Because I don't want anyone else to go through what I did, and now it's up to you to ensure that too." He smiled, this time without arrogance. "I'll make sure of it." At that moment, he knew that although he could never erase the past, he had found a new way to move forward. And for the first time, that was enough. Andrade and Lima had changed, and so had he.